recorded.
So I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Can only one person record? Can Michael record at the same time as
Michael,
a
we were going to
test?
try that. Did you do it?
As a
No,
test?
yeah, no, we discovered that it is not possible for me to do any kind of recording on my system on this new version of GoToMeeting.
Okay.
Does anybody that's online with us have the little record button showing up on their interface? Mark, do you?
No, I don't.
I have the record button, but when I hover over it, it's got the little circle with a cross through it sign.
Yeah.
In other words, I can't push it.
Yeah. So as far as I know, the answer is no, Mark. But that is something I can ask them. But
It was just an idea for a test. So
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we'll find out again. It seems to work okay when I'm recording. Now next week, by the way, Brian Smith is going to join us and do part two. Well, I think he's going to do part two of the one that he started. Basically how to worship with people that have totally different ideas than what you have, and I do have a little experience at that. But looking forward to Brian being on there. Michael uh, talked to him last Sabbath. He was down in West Tennessee, and uh, he agreed. And then I got an email from him, so we're all set up, I think, for next week. So, okay, I always try to put up this timesheet. What am I trying to say? The uh, anyway that Mark gave us, and you can see going all the way over to the left. It doesn't go back to Solomon and David and even Saul. It starts when Jeroboam the first was given the 10 tribes in the north, and that's in the yellow, and then in the green it starts with the son of Solomon, Rehoboam, and coming all the way across. And we are still in the yellow all the way over here to Hosea. Hosea is what some people pronounce it, but it's actually Hosea. And you can see that the prophet Hosea is prophesied from about 752 all the way over to a little bit before the Assyrian captivity. And as I understand it, Hosea went down to Judah to live, and that's where he wrote the his book Hosea's prophecy, Hosea. And by the way, before I forget, on Wednesday night, as you all know, I quit doing the Bible study on Wednesday night, but Blake Silverstein and John Reedy are going to take that over and do it about something like once a month or every other week or whatever. So you may be getting an email from Blake. I think he's the one that's going to send it out to give you the ability to open up a GoToMeeting to be with them. Okay, well today we are going to try to go through Hosea chapter 10, and there's 15 verses in Hosea. And as I've told you before, I get a lot of help from commentaries, because I just poetry, and I just I can't see the metaphors in them or the analogies, or some of them are songs and so on. So we'll try to get through this one today. Hosea 10:1, Hosea says, Israel empties his vine. He brings forth fruit for himself. And according to the multitude of his fruit, he has increased the altars. According to the bounty of his land, they have embellished his sacred pillars. And this is one that I can, sort of understand. I think what Hosea is saying here is the more God blesses Israel, the more he gives to them, the more they go out and worship these other gods. And it's hard for us to understand that, but we don't live in that society. We don't know what it was like at all, and we're reading different language, and so on. But Israel was a blessed nation, and I can't help but think if Jeroboam, when God gave him 10/12 or 5/6 of the nation of Israel, God's people, he could have had, without a doubt, the best nation ever on the earth. But no, he chose to, oh, well, hey, I got to be careful. I can't let these people go back down to Jerusalem because we're going to lose them. So let's put some idols up in Dan and in the northern part of Israel, and let's put one in the southern part of Israel in Bethel. And those are the ones that you need to worship. And as we go through this chapter, we're going to see a couple of verses where Bethel, the one that's on the southern border, becomes the place where most of the worship of Baal and Astaroth and other gods, most of it's done. It becomes, Rome, if you will. It becomes, wherever these headquarters are of different churches. So Israel was a blessed nation, but after many years of blessings, Israel, well, actually from the very start, Israel started using the blessings for the wrong purposes and giving credit to false gods. And I can't help but think they knew better. I mean, they had just left Judah. I mean, just split off from Judah, and they knew who one true God was, certainly at the beginning. And I'm like, how in the world did this happen? She had totally forgotten the true God. And this is over time. I think they were in there for 240 years, if I'm not mistaken. But she had totally forgotten the true God the people had, and had been worshiping false idols instead. And as we've talked about before, Dr. Heiser and Mark and Michael have both talked on here about the Elohim that were little g gods that were there in this nation and causing all kinds of trouble. I mean, they weren't just idols of stone and clay and whatever. These were real, should I call them demons? I don't know if I need to go that far, but they were real entities, real angelic beings, if you will. And the more Israel was blessed, the more altars she built to false gods, which is, according to the multitude of his fruit, okay, according to the blessings, he has increased the altars. According to the bounty of his land, they have embellished his sacred altars or pillars. I'm sorry. And so Israel had become, I think Hosea uses this analogy. Well, we can see that he uses Israel empties his vine. She became a spreading vine, and she spread, but she had no fruit. Their vine became bloated. and this is metaphorical, of course, and it had no roots and it bore no fruit. And the more prosperity that God bestowed on them, the more they abused his gifts. And they referred credit. This is what blows me away. They referred credit for the blessings to their idols. And you know that first generation knew better. I don't know about after that, but idol worship began almost from the moment Israel became a nation under Jeroboam. We don't know how long it was from the time that Jeroboam was told, you're going to be the king, before he set up the two idols. And then they set up more idols and more idols and more idols. And Bethel, as we will see as we go through this chapter, became headquarters, so to speak. So the vine here is used as a metaphor for Israel. And here's an example in Isaiah. It says, and now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem, as it's talking about Jerusalem, and men of Judah, judge, I pray you, between me and my vineyard. What could have been done more to my vineyard that I've not done in it? Now, Israel is the vineyard. What more could he have done? Wherefore, when I looked that it should bring forth grapes, it brought forth wild grapes, which I presume are not good. You can't make wine out of it, and so on, in this analogy.
Hey, Skip.
Yes.
Where you talked about in the previous verse how they gave the second generation gave credit to the wrong God and the first generation didn't say anything. It makes me wonder if people nowadays, Christian nowadays, that's the whole big thing. We don't want to offend anybody. I mean, I wonder if they had that same kind of mentality of not wanting to offend. So instead of standing up for the truth, they just kind of got along to get along, which is wrong. But I'm just wondering, just a little side note.
Yeah, that's a good we don't know point. We like to use those, but yeah, that's an interesting concept. And I think in verse 5 it says, now go, I'll tell you what I'll do to my vineyard. Okay, if you guys don't straighten up, I'm going to take away the hedge thereof. And this is a hedge of protection. If you think about it, carrying this metaphor or analogy on, God put up a hedge to protect his people. And it says it shall be eaten up because I'm going to take away the hedge. And I'm going to break down the wall that protects you. And it shall be trodden down. And I'm going to lay it waste. It won't be pruned, won't be dug. And there shall come up briars and thorns. And I will also command the clouds that they don't rain. There's scripture that talked about the skies would become like iron, I believe. In verse 7, for the vineyard of Yahweh of hosts is the house of Israel. And the men of Judah, because he includes both of them here, his pleasant plant. They were his people. And he looked for judgment, but all he could see was oppression for righteousness. And behold a cry. And I'm not sure what the behold a cry means, but it's there. So if anybody has any thoughts on what maybe he's talking about there, I don't. As I told you, I'm not a poetry guy. Okay, verse 2 says their heart is divided and they're held guilty. He will break down their altars. He will ruin their sacred pillars. Now, remember, this is 235, 37, 38 years after Jeroboam the first was put in charge of the northern tribes. So a lot's gone on, and God has been very merciful to these people, very patient. But it says their heart is divided. And the prophets don't speak of it much. And I don't think I've talked about it much. Maybe some of you all have. but I don't think we've talked about it much, that some of the people attempted to maintain a semblance of devotion to the God of Israel along with the worship of idols. And, we see some of that today. In 1 Kings 18:21, Elijah spoke about this after the prophets of Baal were killed. They were up on Mount Carmel, and Elijah came to the people and said, how long are you going to be working with two sides? How long halt you between two opinions? If Yahweh is the one true Elohim, follow him. But if it's Baal, Lord, and the many different Baals, then follow him. And the people didn't say a word. You may remember when we went over that. That's been, goodness gracious, that's been a while. Israel's unfaithfulness established her guilt, and it necessitated her punishment. God had been so patient with these people, and he had tolerated their false worship. But he got to the end of his proverbial rope, as they say. They had multiplied their altars, as it said in verse 1, and they slew their sacrifices on them against his will. In other words, their sacrifices were just fake. They weren't really sacrificing to the one true God. They were going through the motions. So now, after all these years, should the altars themselves be demolished, they're going to get broken down, and the sacred pillars used in pagan worship will be devastated. Because the same is true here of the heart of a guilty people. And God would destroy both the altars and the sacred stones they had erected, but God himself didn't destroy them. The nations that Israel slept with, if you will, that committed adultery with, that went to them and made bargains and said, hey, we need you to protect us because we don't have anybody to protect us. And we all know, looking back, they certainly did have someone to protect them, but they didn't call on God to protect them. So the time was coming near, and Israel was soon to become just a memory. Just a memory. And you all know, jump in anytime you want. Verse 3. For now they say, okay, now this is after 240 years. For now they say, we have no king because we did not fear Yahweh. And as for a king, what would he do for us? So, looking at this literally, we have no king. Why did they have no king? Because they kicked him out. They had kicked God out of the country. They kicked him out of their schools. I'm going to get us in trouble, aren't I, Michael? They had kicked him out of the courthouses. They had kicked him out. I'm kind of bringing it up to today. We wonder, why in the world's all this bad stuff happening? Well, hello. We've run him off. So the nation of Israel, their political structure was about to be destroyed, and her king Hosea would be removed. And finally, the people would begin to recognize their own unfaithfulness. Not going to do anything about it, but they began to recognize it. Look, it says, why do we have no king? Because we did not fear Yahweh. And then they said, as for a king, and what would he do for us? There's two ways to look at that, and the commentaries looked at it both ways. As for a king, Yahweh, what would he do for us? Well, he'd been doing for you all for 240 years, and he's done. He's done doing. Or if it's a king, talking about Hosea or, whoever, a physical king, what would he do for us? by this time, the situation had become so hopeless that most of the people in Israel, or many, that may be hyperbole, would realize that not even a king would help them. Not even,
Skip,
yeah,
do, do any of the commentaries indicate, like when he was saying this, like which of the kings he was talking about, or do you think it was the last king?
they're at the very end. So the other ones are dead. I don't know how many kings were alive. Wait, let me look at this.
I mean, when you look at the chart, he prophesied over over a long time, but over several kings.
Yeah, and we
I guess this sort of sounds like it's the last one.
that's kind of the way I take it. That this is
Yeah,
Well,
I was just wondering if there were any comments on it.
no, I didn't see.
well, if Hosea went down to Judah before he started writing the book, which became the book of Hosea, it's possible that Israel, at the time that he penned this chapter, may have already gone into captivity. So you're talking about Hosea being the last king, and these verses that we've read up till now is a depiction of a nation that was blessed, that created a false religion or several false religions, used all their prosperity to build up false altars, false idols, whatever, their version of climate change and transgender, whatever it is that they were worshiping and made powerful, used all their prosperity to fund those things as the new religion. Till you get to this point where, the fact is now they say, because they're already in captivity, maybe when he wrote it, they don't have a king because they didn't fear the Lord as he had admonished them. And as for a king, what would he do for us? I mean, they've sinned, so what would God do for us? Consequences have already been meted out. But the duality of this is, look at the state of Israel, look at our state. When you look at politicians, they're not electing someone that can be a good steward of the foundations that the nation was established on. They're looking for a politician or a king that, what are you going to give us? How much money are you going to fund to our programs? Well, how much, what are you going to do for us? And people, they supported a king based on what they got. It's the way the way the deep state works. How much money are we getting for this? And that's where Israel was. Yeah, but now the consequences have been meted out. And I think maybe when Hosea wrote this, he was in Judah, and the northern tribes had just been taken over by Assyria. I'm guessing it's possible.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. That this, as we go through the rest of this, and I hadn't really looked at it that way when I went through it, but yeah, this may
From an
very well
economic
be
standpoint,
after the fact. I'm sorry, Jim. What?
Skip, from an economic standpoint, and this is when they asked for a king, go back to the first king of Israel, before they asked for a king, and he said, well, he's going to take this, and this. There is no net increase for the populace from a king. I mean, some may get some stuff, but in general, everybody's worse off.
Yeah.
Exactly. But I would also advise that in a time of invasion or conquest, people look to the leadership. And if Hosea's in Judah and Assyria has come in and conquered Bethel and destroyed the king and taken Israel captive, there's a period of anarchy that happens, and there's no order. There's just slaughter. So at that point, people will be looking, well, where's our leadership? Where are those that were supposed to protect us? And the metaphor is, well, we don't have any leadership anymore because we didn't fear God. So we're on our own. There's nobody to protect us whatsoever. And so we get what we get. And why would God step in to save us now? Because we didn't fear God. And if we wanted a king, what's he going to be able to do for us? So, I mean, there's a double entendre over there with that. At least that's how I'm seeing this. But that's just me.
Yeah, and here's something that we all know, and we if it's a good thing to remember. A king set up in opposition to God's will cannot save, and I think that's kind of where Well, I know it's where Israel was, and I think it may be kind of where we are, or the world. Because of Michael, and thank you, Michael. At least I understand that there's a lot more stuff happening out there than just what's happening at 216 Hunt Cliff, Jonesboro, Arkansas. There's a whole world out there, and things are terrible, and we don't have a clue yet. But if our kings are set up in opposition to God's will, we're we're even in more trouble. Okay, so verse 3, when you look at verse 3, well, so all three of them so far, these are the words of despair. They're not words of repentance. They're words of men terrified by the consequences of guilt. They're guilty, but they're not going to do anything about it. They're not coming out of darkness. There's no repentance. And going all the way back to the beginning again, God established Jeroboam as the first king, but he sinned and caused Israel to sin, and they even named a sin after him. And they set up more kings. A king died. Not very many of them in the north died naturally. Most of them were killed. But they didn't set these kings up through God. They never consulted God. They never asked his will about the rules of the kingdom. What should we do here? Or about its relation to the kingdom of Judah. They never talked to him about that. Or the house of David. Hey, maybe our kings ought to come from the house of David too. Yeah.
I take a little bit of, I'm not taking issue, I'm not being contrarian, but they did have a foundation laid. That's the Torah. They had the law of God already established. It was written. So it wasn't like they were clueless as far as a foundation. They just ignored it.
Yeah.
Same with us. We have a constitution that we no longer know or pay any regard. We paid lip service to it. And so did Israel. They paid lip service to the law of God. Which you brought up over the whole aspect of the priests of Baal that were slaughtered. When he asked them, don't be double-minded. They had an understanding of the truth. They just discarded it. So I think what we're reading here are the consequences.
Yeah, Michael, I think that your points are really good. I put it like this, not that it's just a different way of saying the same thing, that we have a society that we're reading about here in Hosea that's just doing what they do. Jeroboam had a specific purpose of removing the influence of the true God from Israel by substituting things on purpose. The other thing that we haven't talked about very much is that God had a plan to his direction was to remove the Canaanites because they didn't fit with the purpose that God had for Israel. And as we know, Israel didn't remove them. They stayed there, and their influence was societal. It spread throughout the whole society. If you have the Israelites who are being told, there's no reason to go to Jerusalem. Don't look at Jerusalem. Look at these, we've got these statues here. These are your gods, O Israel. And then you have all of these Canaanites who are in the land. They weren't driven out. They were in the land, and they influenced society. And without a purpose, the Israelites just naturally went with the flow of the land. Now, yeah, they may have known certain things, but they really didn't. I mean, people conduct their lives depending on their devotion to certain things. So a likeness is that we, if we were not devoted to God, we'd just be kind of floating around in society doing what everybody else did. But we know that we should be devoted to God and follow his ways, his thinking, his influence, pray to him, have a relationship with him, and it influences our lives. There are tons and tons and tons of people that doesn't cross their mind. They just live life, they're influenced with things around them, and they just go with the flow. It's like Erica said, they just, do whatever. I think that's the snapshot we're giving. And every once in a while, something happens and people straighten up and say, yeah, you know what? I really do follow God. And they keep on doing what they've been doing. So if we think about it that way, that might help give us some context to think. I think it's probably a misnomer for us to think about the Israelites in the land talked about by Hosea as having a cognizant daily realization that they were following a God. They were just doing stuff. And the overall influence of the society around them, which was Canaanite to a large degree, was influencing them. Yeah, they were a different people. They kind of knew that, but life is life and you got to get along. That's it.
I think
Mark?
you're
Yeah,
exactly
that's
right. Go ahead,
Mark,
Michael.
all.
Or Jim, I'm
Go
sorry.
ahead.
I'm
Somebody.
sorry. It
Someone else
it
have more?
looks like when you get to verse 3, by then they sort of recognized how they've messed up. It said, "For now they say, we have no king because we did not fear Jehovah." I didn't fear Yahweh. Um, so I don't know. Some of this is confusing too.
Well,
Well,
again,
Hosea is.
I said,
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
no, I was answering Jim. I said I think that's why this is probably written this past tense. This is Hosea probably in Judah writing after the northern tribes had just got taken into captivity by Assyria. So he's these are the consequences that happened as a result of the fact that of this mindset that existed up there, as Mark was talking. I mean, they basically created a whole new religious system for themselves. They're going with the flow. They had a Canaanite religious system, which was totally contrary to the foundations that Yahweh established for them in Torah. If you wanted to draw an allegory, we are essentially socialists in this country, but that's not our foundations in the United States of America. But we're basically quasi kleptocratic socialists. We've established a whole different kind of a cultural or a political culture that was not intended for us. But everybody goes with the flow because they figured out how to work all the loopholes and get advantage by doing this, so they go with it, and it remains and it stands, and there isn't any repentance because nobody wants to go back. It would require them to dismantle all the altars that we've established that are contrary to the foundations. And I think Israel was that's exactly what they did. It's the same thing. But I think Hosea here is writing in the past tense, like that they've already gone into captivity, and he's writing this as these are the consequences for the mindset that existed when I was trying to get you guys to wake up and you would not repent. At least that's how I'm reading this.
I think you're right. And as we get farther into this, we're going to find more verses that sound like the captivity's already happened. We'll find a few that make it sound like it hadn't already happened. But I think the point that you all are making, is exactly right. The nation has probably already been taken captive. Hosea is down in Judah, and he's writing this, and he's looking back over over what happened. And he knew people who took the attitude, we have no king and it's our fault because we didn't fear Yahweh. You know,
I
I
have
think you've got a good point.
I have an alternate view.
Okay.
I don't think that they are in captivity. Look at Hosea 10:1. Israel is a luxuriant vine. Verse 2, their heart is false. So it doesn't say, and then in the end of the second part of verse 2, Yahweh will break down their altars and destroy their pillars. So
that may depend on your translation, because mine says Israel was a spreading vine. Their heart is deceitful, and now they must bear their guilt. So, depending on the translation, the implication in mine is that they're bearing their guilt now in captivity because they were a spreading vine and were deceitful.
Yeah, we're going to see scriptures going through. There's only 15 verses in this chapter, but we're going to see some that seem to say that they're in captivity, and we're going to see some that seem to say that they're not. So it's interesting. I wonder, why Hosea chose to write it this way.
Well, perhaps
language.
perhaps both could apply in the sense that the invasion and was in waves. It wasn't in one mass thing.
Well, now that's
Yes.
a fact. That's exactly what happened.
Yes. That and the fact that we have language issues, translation into English issues. And, we've talked about that extensively, and that's something I'm a lot more sensitive to. And the fact that, you can't get an accurate translation from, ancient Hebrew into English in some cases. I mean, that's why we have so many different translations. And we talked about language, and that may have something to do in play here as far as the way this is applied. That's always a possibility. But I like the idea of the fact that it could go both ways, because the invasion did happen in stages.
Well,
Yeah.
we have to remember too that the chapter divisions were not in the original text. And if you look at the last verse of the chapter before, it says, my God will reject them because they have not obeyed him. They will be wanderers among the nations. So it obviously could be either way. It could be a warning about what's coming, but sometimes the chapter divisions make you give you a false sense of the context.
Yeah. Okay. Well, they didn't refer any matters whatsoever to God, and as if there was no God, is no God. And Ephraim's kings, and Ephraim is the northern tribes are called lots of different things. Ephraim's one of them. They were made and changed without the counsel and advice of God, especially when they were killing each other. And now at the close of all of this, they reflected on how fruitless it all was. And the time referred to can only have been just before the captivity or just after the captivity. I'm going to throw both of those in there. When Israel's kings showed themselves to be ineffectual, both in tackling Israel's problems and in coping with the Assyrian menace. And yes, the nation was taken little by little. So it makes sense that Hosea, looking at what has happened, can both talk about past and future, because they're still, maybe they hadn't officially all gone in, but many of the communities have been taken captive. So
Well, that makes an excellent parallel with where we are today. I mean, look at what was a God-fearing nation, and look at where we are now. And we're well on the way to going into captivity. But it's a gradual process, and we're doing it to ourselves. And you look back at how this country was founded and where we are now, and it's a gradual walk towards almost like a voluntary captivity that we're going to end up in.
Yeah. And
Uh,
go ahead.
well, I'm seeing a difference between the prophet of Amos from Hosea. Amos mentioned captivity, but he never mentioned Assyria. You can't find the word Assyria in Amos, but here in Hosea, Assyria is mentioned many times, and well, Hosea probably didn't need God to tell him point blank, well, Assyria is going to take you over. All the signs were there. So anyway, Hosea knows that their captivity is going to be taken by Assyria. That's all I got to say on that.
Yeah, and they had already taken several communities, cities, or whatever you want to call it, into captivity. The last two lines of verse 3 note despairingly that even if the land did have a truly capable king, things were so bad that he'd be powerless to help. And I think that's where they were. Whether this is before or after, you know, King's not going to be able to do anything. He's just one person. All right, verse 4. They have spoken words, swearing falsely in making a covenant. Thus judgment springs up like hemlock in the furrows of the field. Now, the commentaries looked at this as false oaths between the people and between the leadership of Israel and the nations that they made covenants with. They didn't look at this like it was between them and God. I don't know if that's true or not, but it kind of makes a little bit of sense. He calls it a deceitfulness of heart, or implies, and promises had been made, false oaths had been taken, contracts signed, and the thought here mainly concerns agreements among the people themselves. In the context of the promises, oaths, and agreements are probably related to political policies. Now, this is what some of the commentaries were saying. And there's an interesting agricultural image in verse 4 about the hemlock and furrows of the field. Lawsuits have sprung up like poisonous weeds in a plowed field. People couldn't trust one another, and a few were and very few were keeping their promises. So they had to sue each other to get what they had agreed upon. And it wasn't just among the people of Israel that these false oaths happened. Covenants were broken with other nations. Whoever gave them a better deal. We'll make a deal with Assyria. Boy, this is a really good. Oh, wait a minute, Syria is going to make us a better. Oh, Egypt is going to come in and do such and such, and so they were terrible business people, if that's the way to look at this, and so it caused anger and distrust between nations. And Hosea says, judgment springs up as hemlock in the furrows of the field. Divine judgment shall spring up as rank and deadly as hemlock in the furrows, so they're ripe for divine judgment. Now, I got that out of some commentary. So,
Another way to look at that, Skip, also another application of that last verse is when justice is turned into a weapon, politically speaking, that also acts like a poison to where prosperity cannot prosper, because you've got to do legal studies, and you've got to have it cleared by legal, and you can be sued into oblivion before any fruit comes forth. But well, look what they're doing to the oil and gas industry in this country. They're destroying the prosperity that we have. We're no longer energy independent because of, basically, for lack of a better word, lawfare. So it could be not only divine judgment, which would act like a poison against evil in the land, but at the same time, we're our own authors of spreading poison by perverting the justice system with swearing falsely and making bogus covenants and things of that nature. So that's a consequence of evil.
Would that also apply to inequitable justice? Justice for some, but not for all, so to speak.
Amen.
Two-tiered justice system. Same crimes not pursued, and over pursuit of crimes that simply are not as heinous as they appear to be.
yeah, and this is such a small part of what you just said, Mark, but it makes me think of this, and you all know how much I love sports. Since the 60s, women in this country have said, we want to be treated equally, and they should be. We want the same jobs. We want the same pay. And today we say, okay, yeah, but now when you're gonna swim, you got to swim against the guy. We got to be fair about this, And I know that's a little thing, but I'm telling you, it just burns me up.
It's symbolic. It's symbolic of a bigger issue, a more widespread issue.
Yeah. Okay. Verse 5. The inhabitants of Samaria. Now, here's another word that means the whole country. The inhabitants of Samaria fear because of the calf of Beth Aven, for its people mourn it, and its priests shriek. I don't know if they meant shrink or shriek for it. I guess they shriek for it because its glory has departed from it. Beth Aven is Bethel. And I don't remember if Amos did it, but I know Hosea has all the way through here. He didn't call it Bethel much anymore. He calls it Beth Aven, which means house of nothing, where Bethel means house of God. And so Hosea has, through sarcasm, I suppose, he's talking about the calf that was put in Bethel, but he's calling it Beth Aven, which means a house of nothing. It was the house of God before Jeroboam got there and turned it into a false place to worship. Bethel had actually become the cultic center of false worship. It was closer to Judah. It was right on the border. It was not way up where Dan was, and apparently this is one of the areas, which is what we've been talking about, where the Assyrian army had already captured it, had broken down the altars, and had caused great fear among its worshipers. The priests mourning here, its priests shriek for it, were idolatrous priests. They were priests of Baal. And they had lost their main place of worship, and they mourned for it. and its priests shriek for it. Now, I've somewhere in my notes, yeah, here it is. The Hebrew word translated priest is only used 3 times in the Hebrew scriptures. This noun is well attested throughout the Semitic world. Obviously, I got this from a dictionary. And it appears as a loan word in Greek, Loan, loan as in borrowed. And it's attested in Egyptian as well. The noun refers to an idolatrous priest. So there's no question that these are the priests of Baal that are shrieking for their place of worship that they've lost. But this idolatrous priest here does not serve Yahweh. He is a pagan priest, and he's mourning for his place of worship. I can kind of picture this, back when Elijah destroyed, the whole temple worship. I mean, not temple, but mountain worship for those people when he called down fire from heaven, and then he had all of these same kind of priests killed, and so on. Now, here's what one commentary says: the inhabitants of Samaria, about this verse, the inhabitants of Samaria shall fear because of the calves of Beth Haven. The calf. What calves? Well, the golden calves and other statues and idols and so on. He calls them in this place cow calves, perhaps to denote their weakness and helplessness. There's really nothing more weak than an Elohim that's not a part of God's Elohim. They have no power. But people give them power. And it says Bethel, the house of God of the patriarch Jacob, was turned into Bethaven, the house of vanity, or the house of nothing. This, from its old sacred memories, was a more celebrated place of calf worship than Dan, because more people, that people were probably coming up from Judah, and we know they were coming down from different parts of Israel. For the people shall mourn over it. They had set up idols instead of God. So God no longer calls them his people, but the people of the calf, whom they had chosen for their God. As Moab was called the people of Chemosh, its idol. They had joyed in it, not in Yahweh, not in the true God. And now they, its people and its priests, are mourning over the loss of Bethaven. And well, that's it for that. Any comments? Because
I guess in a nutshell.
Yeah.
Well, I was just saying, you asked for comments. That I read this verse as, to be brief, people are mourning and shrieking because the glory days are gone.
Yeah.
They're not coming back. They're gone.
Yeah. Yeah, and there again, because we know that Assyria had taken pieces. Well, not only Assyria, but Egypt and Syria had also taken pieces of Israel. So somebody has taken this city, and they no longer have it to worship. And let's think of the Catholics. What if Rome was taken by the Muslims?
That's a great allegory there, Skip. They would lament and be upset, just like this verse would say.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. Anybody else? All right, verse 6. The idol also shall be carried to Assyria. I think this is connected with this one. The idol also shall be carried to Assyria, as a present for King Jerob. Ephraim shall receive shame, and Israel shall be ashamed of his own counsel. Now, I think you can also look at this as we've all mentioned, and Jill in particular with her translation. The idol's already been carried to Assyria, or the idol will be carried to Assyria. One way or the other, the calf that the people worship, that they love, is going away or has gone away. It's gone to Assyria. And the people are like, whoa, 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 whoa. We've got to worship this calf in Bethel. We can't worship this calf in Assyria. And it's been given to King Jerob. Now, I think the commentaries weren't sure which king that was, but it doesn't really matter. The calf, the golden calf, and the other idols that were in Bethel or Bethaven were taken to Assyria as a present for King Jerob. No wonder the priests were shrieking. And Ephraim shall receive shame. Yeah, someone going to say something?
I was about to say, again, it has to do with translation. If this is King Jerob, then this is being written in the past tense, because wasn't it Tiglath-Pileser that did the invasion of Samaria and Bethel? Wasn't he king at the time that happened?
Yeah,
I'm going from
Sam
memory.
Hazer or something like that, the third. I don't.
Or maybe it was Tiglath-Pileser the first invasion, and then that second king. But if it's King Jerob, unless he had another name, then would this maybe indicate that this is even later in the timeline, and that Hosea is actually writing this past tense?
Could
Just a
be.
thought. I'm just throwing it out.
You know, I think we can safely say that because pieces of Israel were taken, that, you know, maybe one verse in here, he's talking about a place that hadn't been taken yet. This one sounds like it's already been taken. Verse 5 certainly sounds like it's already been taken. But every city, you know, I don't think has already been taken to Assyria. Maybe they have, but you know, I think you all have convinced me. Maybe you didn't mean to, but I think you've convinced me that we're talking about pieces of Israel, and not the whole
Maybe.
nation. You know.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was just zeroing in on King Jerob, and I don't recall that particular Assyrian king being on the throne at the time of the initial invasion and the final invasion, when Bethel was sacked.
Yeah.
I mean, Samaria was taken. So I guess this name doesn't ring any bells for me. So that's why I was wondering if it was a later king of Assyria.
That word is usually translated Jeroboam.
Really?
The only place that so I just looked up that word, how it's translated. The only place it's translated great king is here in Hosea. Everywhere else it's translated Jeroboam, or the root of it is translated Jeroboam. Well, no, there's a couple of other places, but it's way back in Samuel, and so I'm not a word expert, but when I look at how this word is translated, or the root of this word is translated in the scripture, it's Jeroboam.
Yeah. So this has to be a metaphor. Jeroboam's long dead.
Well, it's a tribute to him.
Oh, a trip. Okay.
I mean, you could possibly see it that way, but I mean, the translators, I don't know. They either say King Jerob or the great king, and the root of it is translated Jeroboam.
Yeah, in honor of him, I guess. A tribute to him. That's interesting, Mark. Thanks. Okay, so now Hosea is speaking clearly of the Assyrian captivity. I mean, it's right here it says, but it's also talking about Bethel, the idol that we just talked about in verse 5, was the calf, the golden calf, and says the shameful calf idol would be carried to the victorious king of Assyria as tribute, and Israel would feel disgrace and humiliation. So not only the calf idol, but also Samaria and its king would be taken, borne away to foreign Assyria, and it helpless as a twig on a river. And we're going to have that in one of the scriptures in a minute. So y'all can be thinking about that. If a twig is in a swift traveling river, well, that baby is helpless. There is no doubt. So I think what we've got here is that not only shall or has Israel been carried into captivity, but it's God also, not a big G God, not the one true God, but it's God, the idol. The victory over a nation, and this is typical of kind of the way things happened back then. The victory over a nation was accounted as a victory over its gods. And you remember when Israel won a battle, and I can't remember who they were fighting, but the ones that lost, I think this was Syria, I think, said, oh, well, the reason we lost that is that the gods of Israel are gods of the hills, and we were fighting them in the valley. And or vice versa. You get my point. There were gods of the hills and gods of the valley, and they were trying to capture the gods of the hills, and they lost because that's who Israel's gods were. I don't know if I ever said that right, but anyway. And the calf isn't able to save its worshipers from deportation. The calf is going to be carried off, and Israel's going to be ashamed of his own counsel. They're going to be ashamed
Not
of
only that,
what?
I'm sorry, Skip. Not only that, but that calf was worth a lot because it was made out of solid gold.
Well, it's true. Yeah. Yep. Good point. I'm not sure how much gold and silver was worth here, but you do make a good point. The king of Assyria would certainly think it was valuable. Okay, verse 7. Here's the twig I was telling you about. As for Samaria, and this is Israel, her king is cut off like a twig on the water, has no strength, has no ability to help himself or his people. He's just floating. Now, another translation here, and some of you may have it, is foam. As for Samaria, her king is cut off like foam on the water. And it's the same way. The foam is going to, drift down the river, and a twig's going to drift down the river. And the calf idol would be removed from the coming invasion. It was helpless too. And float away is literally be destroyed. So as for Samaria, her king is cut off and destroyed like a twig or like a little foam on the river. So the waters of the nation, if you will, would be swept away by the current and brought to ruin. And with that thought, the monarchy will vanish as quickly as foam or a twig on the surface of the water. And we know that's happening or has already happened. Now, here's another talking
Skip,
about. Yeah, Mark.
here's an interesting quote quote that has a nice picture. This idol will be taken into exile, unable to save itself, as Isaiah points out concerning the idols of Babylon. The people and the idolatrous priests, far from acknowledging its uselessness, will mourn over it as it is carried to Assyria as tribute for the great king. Literally, this is King Yarub, which is probably related to the word for strive or quarrel. George Adam Smith translated it as King Pick-Quarrel. This seems likely to be right, for it certainly fits in with the character of the aggressive Assyrian kings. The picture then changes to the city of Samaria and its king floating away like a twig on the water, powerless to do anything about it.
Wow, that is interesting. Okay.
So seemingly the aggressive part of it, while Jeroboam was kind of that way, but this commentary says this is definitely something that's related to the idol being carried away, and the in comparison to the king of Samaria floating away like a twig.
Yeah, and like Jim said a minute ago, any idol that's made of gold is going. They're not going to leave those in Israel. One of the amazing things about this to me is that this whole nation has disappeared. How many people were there? 3, 4, 5 million? I don't know. You all may know a lot better than me. We don't know where they are. Now, I know a lot of people think they know where they are, and maybe they're right. But I'm going to stand on the we don't know where they are. They're scattered. And that's kind of this twig on the water. You throw a bunch of twigs out on the water, and it won't be long before they disappear. That's probably a terrible analogy, but I'm good at terrible analogies. Okay, in verse 8, also the high places of Aven, here again, this is Beth Aven. The high places of Aven, the sin of Israel, shall be destroyed. I mean, this was the headquarters for the worship of Baal and Astaroth and whatever else little g gods there are. The thorn and thistle shall grow on their altars. So we're talking about this place is going to be left fallow for a long time. And then the people shall say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills fall on us. And this, of course, reminds me of, and you all too, of what it says in Revelation. But Bethel or Beth Aven, yeah.
I was going to say, yeah, you mentioned it was in Revelation, but it's also Jesus quotes it in Luke. And he's talking in Luke 23, which is parallel to Matthew 24. Right after he says that people in those days will say, blessed are the wombs that never gave birth.
Yeah.
And at that time, they will say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us.
Yeah.
So there's an interesting parallel here.
Yep, it sure is.
So one other thing to get out of that, those quotes, when Jesus said those things, and when John wrote them in Revelation, but let's just take Jesus' statement. He is calling people's remembrance back to this, as Michael pointed out. And that's kind of like a hyperlink. When he said that, their thoughts would go back here to Hosea and what Hosea said about why they were suffering. Israel was suffering the problems. And so it was to call them back to God's warning by his prophets about what was going on and the destruction that was taking place.
All said. Yep.
Okay. Now Bethel was on a hill. It says the high places of Avon or Bethaven or Bethel, the sin of Israel. I mean, this place is so bad they called it the sin of Israel. And from different sides, people were said to go up to it. So they were able to climb this hill or this mountain or whatever. And the high place means shrine or house of high places. And we all know that Jeroboam had built one of these at Bethel. And somebody said earlier about they were supposed to have run everybody off that was there before they got in there, the Canaanites. But there were a whole bunch of high places in this country, in the geography of this country, so that wherever they wanted to start a pagan worship service, there was something already there. And so whoever Jeroboam the first wanted to consecrate as a priest, he could, and he had a church for him. I'm using that word church a little loosely. And then it says the thorn and the thistle shall come up upon their altars. These places aren't going to be used anymore. They're going to disintegrate. And you all have seen places where a tree grows up through solid rock. Well, it's not solid, or the tree wouldn't have made it. But you know what you get what I'm pointing. The thorn and the thistle is going to grow out of these stones. And so this pictures not only the desolation of this high place, but the forced cessation of idolatry. And so fire destroys and puts down the root, all vegetable life. And then it says the thorn, or my source, the thorn once blackened by fire puts out no fresh shoot. The words of the prophet became sort of proverbial, saying, for misery which longs for death rather than life. These people that want, cover us and kill us, these stones. Okay, so Avon meant nothing. I think we've discussed that enough. And it's what Bethel had become, a place of nothing. And the calf then probably became a center of idolatry. And many high places were formed around it till Bethel became the metropolis of idolatry. This was the sin of Israel, as it says in the first sentence of verse 8. And it was the source of all of its sins. Destruction there by the Assyrians would be so complete that thorns and thistles would replace the buildings containing the altars, be totally destroyed, nothing left. And the people would cry in despair for the mountains and the hills to fall on them, to terminate their lives and to terminate their time of disgrace. Verse 9. Now, this is something we talked about a few weeks ago, and hopefully you all will remember. O Israel, you have sinned from the days of Gibeah. There they stood. The battle in Gibeah against the children of iniquity did not overtake them. This is, you find this story in Judges 19 and 20, and we did talk about it. And it was about the rape and murder of a concubine in Gibeah. And Hosea brings it up again. as a type of the sins of the nation of Israel that they've been committing for 240 years. The days of Gibeah recall the hideous story of lust and crime, which was the low water mark of the lawless days of old. Remember, I said it's in Judges. They didn't have anybody in charge. Every once in a while, a judge would pop up, but there were areas where there was nobody who was controlling anything. And this was one of the most heinous things that had ever happened. And so it had caused a war between Benjamin and the rest of Israel. All 12 tribes were involved in this war. So once more, the prophet refers to the sin at Gibeah or Gibeah. I don't know how you pronounce it. And Israel has definitely continued in the same basic sin, and the appropriate punishment, which was meted out to the original offenders, has not yet been experienced, but is now due, but has been experienced in parts of Israel, maybe all. And it talks about the double sin. Let's say it may be in the next verse. Yeah, it's in the next verse. Okay. And Hosea, speaking on behalf of Yahweh, says, when it is my desire, I will chasten them. When the time's right, I will chasten them. People shall be gathered against them when I bind them for their two transgressions. Okay. At the time of Yahweh's choosing, he would punish or discipline Israel by gathering the nations against her. And the translation and the meaning of this final line are uncertain. I didn't find a single commentary that knew what when I bind them for their two transgressions meant. And I went outside. I even did a Google search. What is this talking about? And nobody has a good answer. Now, the NIV thinks that it's a reference to captivity and approaching exile. But a better translation here is when they are harnessed to their double sin rather than two transgressions. And the imagery is that of plowing. Israel is pictured as yoked to her sin like a heifer. Now, this is, I'm getting this from other sources. Her two transgressions may refer to Israel's former sin at Gibeah and her present guilt, which is similar to what was going on at Gibeah. And another way to look at it is it could be referring to the sins of forsaking God and departing from the rule of David's house. The problem is nobody knows.
I found a reference. And this is out of the New Bible Commentary. It says the reference to the double sin may well refer to the sins of idolatry and reliance upon foreign alliances rather than on God.
Okay.
So that's another idea.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. There's a cross reference in my software that points to 1 Kings 12:28, which says, so the king took counsel, this is talking about Jeroboam, and made two calves of gold. Okay, so it's just a cross reference that points to the two calves of gold.
Okay, that's another way to look at it. Yeah.
One set up in Bethel and the other one set up in Dan.
Yeah.
For the south part and the north part. So they wouldn't have to go to Jerusalem.
That works too. Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Now here comes another agricultural, or not agricultural, but animal wise. Ephraim is a trained heifer that loves to thresh grain, but I harnessed her fair neck. I will make Ephraim pull a plow. Judah shall plow, and Jacob shall break his clods. Okay, the comparison of this, Israel is a cow, Ephraim is a trained heifer. A trained heifer loves to thresh because they get to eat as they go through there. But I harnessed her fair neck where she couldn't eat any of the fresh grain or corn or whatever it was they were threshing. So it was a light task, and made pleasant by the fact that the creature was not muzzled and was free to eat. So it pulled the threshing sledge over the gathered corn or grain or whatever it was, and it was happy. And this, of course, is a metaphor of Israel. However, Israel had abandoned this relatively easy task. If you think about when God first set Israel up, said, "Hey, Jeroboam, you're in charge," and Jeroboam messed everything up. And so they had to be yoked, as it were, to sin. So Yahweh would place a different yoke on Israel's neck and force her to engage in the arduous work of plowing, where they can't move their head down and grab a piece of corn or some grain. Yahweh required within the covenant relationship, and the plowing referred to the hardship that would accompany the exile. I must have left some words out of that. That didn't make any sense. The object of the metaphor is to picture what God willed and trained his people to do. Ephraim is a trained heifer that loves to thresh grain. But they took as much pains in committing sin and committing evil that he said, okay, if that's what you want, that's what you're going to get. And the central metaphor is that Israel was a trained heifer, and the nation is likened to a healthy animal eager to plow the ground. And in this case, Yahweh is the farmer who yokes Israel and Judah with the goal of sowing a proper relationship with him and to enjoy the benefits of his unfailing love. And this is God's desire for both Ephraim, both Israel, and Judah. But it didn't work. They refused to listen to him. They refused to obey God's laws. Verse 12. Sow for yourselves righteousness. Reap in mercy. Break up your fallow ground, for it's time to seek Yahweh till he comes and rains righteousness on you. So even in the midst of all of these verses that we've seen of condemnation, of judgment, of bad things are going to happen, God held out the possibility of repentance and blessing. Sow for yourself righteousness. Reap in mercy. In other words, repent. Break up your fallow ground. Break up the sins. Stop sinning. And so he uses agricultural imagery, and he urged Israel to seek Yahweh by cultivating righteousness or cultivating justice and reaping his unfailing love. Well, guess what? They didn't listen. They didn't pay any attention whatsoever. So here in verse 12, Hosea gives one more appeal to the nation to repent and seek Yahweh. Fallow ground is land that's lain idle, and has become hard and full of weeds. And so this sounds a little bit like John the Baptist. Repent, bear fruits worthy of repentance. Our job, or Israel's job, was to break up hard hearts before the seed of the word can be planted. And then gracious rain can be sent from heaven. But they didn't listen. They didn't repent. They didn't start following God's law. They didn't care. They kept going to Bethel or whatever temple site they had where they could go worship their false idols. And the nation didn't repent. And judgment fell. In 722 BC, the Assyrian army invaded the land. Now, as we've talked about, they had picked off pieces of the land, for years. So had Syria, so had Egypt. And so the 10 tribes, once it was finally over, they vanished from the pages of history. Try to find something about Israel 400 years after their captivity in Assyria. You're not going to find it. Oh, you'll find somebody wrote it in the book, but you're not going to find it in a true history book. Verse 13, more agricultural. You've plowed wickedness. You've reaped iniquity. Think about that. They've plowed wickedness. They plowed sin, and they've reaped iniquity. What else are you going to reap when you plow wickedness? This agricultural metaphor. You've eaten the fruit of lies. Why? Because you trusted in your own way. Wow, aren't we good at that? All humans. We are good at trusting in our own way, or in the multitude of your mighty men. Right now, we're depending on our leaders, depending on, the army or the navy or the whatever. So the exhortation in verse 12 actually summarizes the appeal made by Israel's prophets throughout her history. Sow for yourselves righteousness, reap in mercy, break up Israel didn't listen. This country hasn't listened. And he says, instead, you've plowed wickedness and reaped iniquity. So instead of relying on the power of God, the nation had depended on her own military might and agreements with other nations. And they not only did not do what God commanded, but they did exactly the opposite. They cultivated wickedness. They broke up their unplowed ground to sow not wheat, but weeds. Now, wouldn't it make sense if you were a farmer that you went out and you plowed and you got the land all ready and you sowed weeds? Well, what are you going to reap? And as they sowed, so they reaped an abundant increase of it. They forsook God's way. They followed the ways of wickedness and unbelief. And when they trusted in their way, not the way, not God's way, but when they trusted in their way, they were trusting in what they and their many warriors could do. Because Israel had depended on her own strength and her many warriors. And God would permit the roar of battle to come against these people. If you remember, it got to a point where Israel had released many of their military men, and they had depended on Baal. So while they were displeasing God, they trusted in the worship of calves and in the help of Egypt and in the help of Assyria and Syria, and they departed from the living God. Verse 14, Therefore, tumult shall arise among your people. You're going to have a lot of problems. You're not going to get along with each other. You're going to fight amongst yourselves. And all your fortresses shall be plundered, as Shalman plundered Beth Arbel in the day of the battle, a mother dashed in pieces upon her children. Now, here's another place. We don't know who Shalman is, and we don't know where Beth Arbel is, and we don't know about this battle. But we do know that it was a horrendous battle. A mother dashed in pieces upon her children. So it says that Yahweh would destroy a source of her false confidence. The severity of the judgment is emphasized by a comparison with a historical incident that was apparently well known to Hosea and well known to Hosea's contemporaries, but was not written in the scriptures. And, I didn't look, for 20 hours, but I looked for a while and I couldn't find anything about where this place was or where this war was. I checked non-biblical sources, but I could find nothing about this war. And so I did find this. The identity of Shalman and the location of Beth Arbel are uncertain. The most popular identifications of Shalman have been these right here. Shalmaneser III, who was the Assyrian ruler who campaigned against the West in the 9th century, or Shalmaneser V, the Assyrian ruler from 727 to 722, but his invasion of Israel postdates Hosea's prophecy. It was after this. And another one, Shalamanu, a Moabite king mentioned in a tribute list of the Assyrian king Tilgath-Pileser III, and a contemporary of Hosea. That if he was a contemporary of Hosea, it might have happened. But Hosea knew about the history of this war in this place. At any rate, this particular battle was vividly remembered for its atrocities, especially the wholesale slaughter of women and children. Bethel, which here represents the nation as a whole, would experience a similar fate because of her great sin. And the fall of Israel's king would signal the conquest of the nation by Babylon later on. And Shalman here is probably Shalmaneser, the king of Assyria, who came up against Hosea early in his reign. And I don't know why this commentary said it's undoubtedly, because nobody knows. But Hosea became his servant and gave him presents. In verse 15, the last verse. Thus it shall be done to you. What shall be done to you? Same thing he's talking about here in verse 14. It's not something that you want done to you. We don't know exactly what it was, but we know it was bad. Thus it shall be done to you, O Bethel, speaking of the nation of Israel, because of your great wickedness. At dawn, the king of Israel shall be cut off utterly. Hosea was cut off finally, and he left neither root nor branch. There's no descendants of Hosea, the king of Israel, anywhere. And Bethel, the calf idol center, representative of all that was wicked in Israel, would experience the same fate as this Beth Arbel, or had experienced the same fate. And it goes on in this verse and says, in that day, even the king of Israel would be completely destroyed. Israel was facing a most foreboding future, or past for some of the nation. Hosea prophesies that her destruction would occur from the very beginning of the day of battle. It ain't going to take long. And the Assyrian was the instrument of the wrath of God. But in order to point out the moral government of God, Hosea says, neither that God did it, nor that the Assyrian did it, but Bethel, once the house of God, which is now the place where they dishonored God, it's going to happen because of your great wickedness. In a morning shall the king of Israel be cut off. Hosea was cut off finally, leaving neither root nor branch. His kingdom perished, and he left no memorial. And we don't even know where the nation is today. You would think that we would know that history would have kept up with them. But nope. That's it. Okay, that's what I got, guys.
Well, I have a comment that's a little bit off to the side, but can you hear me?
Sure, go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. The last comment you made that about them being cut off and you'd think there was some history, I got to thinking early on in this presentation today that you remember back earlier, in Deuteronomy, where they were instructed to keep verbal instruction, to teach their children and to keep everything alive by talking to their children and their grandchildren and walking in the way and whatever.
Yeah.
And how when you stop doing that, then people, you lose all of that instruction and history. And it just made me think about today how if you go back even as far as the invention of television, prior to television, we did have the radio, but people talked more. They read books. They sat around and just talked. And once you had the television, you had people talking at you or to you and taking the place of parents talking to their children. And then, it made me think about today how the television started things, but today it's almost like there's a concerted effort to keep people from talking to one another. And, when it talked about idols being taken down and whatever, it made me think about the tearing down the statues of our history. Because those are things that when kids see the statues and the memorials and whatever, they ask questions, and it opens up a dialogue for the older generation to tell the younger generation what the meaning was behind that statue and the history of it and why it's there and how you should think about it and all those things. And it's almost like you can see the concerted effort to stop that chain of information being passed on down through the generations. And you have to look back at this and wonder, is that what happened back then? Because we can surely see it happening today, the same kind of thing. And I think it must have happened, back then, that they did not maintain that chain of communication that passed on the importance of worshiping God and why we do it and why we have these ceremonies and why we don't want to go into captivity and why we don't worship idols and what it leads to. And it, when you think about it, one of Jesus Christ's titles is the Word. And it just makes you think about the importance of the spoken word and everything that it conveys and can be conveyed through that, method of communication. And when it's lost, we go astray. And it's almost symbolic that you lose the capital W word when you lose the ability to speak freely in your nation. So just some thoughts.
Yeah, that's a really good thought, and it's something that we remember. For some of us, I guess it may be too late, but I'm real fortunate right now that one of our grandsons, as you all know, I think, called me. Okay, Michael, tell everybody hi in Paducah. He asked me, can we do a Bible study every week? And we've done one every Monday night or Tuesday night. We've had to switch a couple of times. So I'm being able to leave something to him that I didn't leave to my kids because of my Pharisaical, terrible person that I was when I became a Christian. But think about the major change in the life of these Israelites in the north, Jill, based on what you just said, who were cut off from the temple, from the teachings and the priests in Jerusalem. I think that's a perfect example of what you're talking about. And I don't know that we've got a watershed moment like that, but our country is going in exactly the same direction as you just said. We've got TV and internet, and I'm just as guilty or more so than anybody else. I don't read anymore. I sit in front of this computer for many, many hours, trying to figure out what Hosea is saying. But anyway, no, I get your point. I think you're exactly right.
Well, what were these Israelites going to do to call people to remembrance? Oh, son, when our nation came out of Egypt, God planned for all of us to live in the promised land, and he set up his temple in Jerusalem. Oh, wait a minute. We got these idols in Bethel and Dan. So what are they going to say?
Yeah.
We can't talk about that. Just like today, we have people promoting and trying to promulgate the idea that the real founding of the country was in slavery being brought over, and they mark that back to 1619 versus the high ideals and purposes that were enumerated in our country's founding. I'm not, that's just an example of what's taken place when the narrative of truth is hijacked and switched to something else. We see that we've already talked about that in a lot of things. It's about gender, it's about justice, it's about a lot of those things. And I think those are all messages for us.
Yeah, and as we all know, they're changing the history books, or have changed the history books, where they don't really read. And maybe when I was in school in the '60s, maybe the history books weren't correct, 100% correct then, but they were a whole lot more correct than they are now. And so what you're saying is exactly right. I mean, what is it that they're being taught? What we're going to teach a 5-year-old that well, now you're a little effeminate. We need to turn you into a girl. I just, we've had a big fight here in Jonesboro at the library over what books they may be going a little overboard. I say the conservatives may be going a little bit overboard censoring books. But one thing that I agree with them on is I don't think certain books should be in the children's group, but that's just my opinion. So I don't know. We're going, we're going down the drain slowly but surely.
Did y'all hear about the one place where the kids actually revolted against being forced to watch LGBTQ some movie? Did y'all hear about that?
No, I hadn't heard about it.
There was a school where the kids actually well, not all the kids, but a lot of the kids got together and revolted by wearing red, white, and blue, or else black for some reason. And they were chanting, "My pronouns are USA." And they were basically pulling down or throwing away a bunch of the LGBTQ stickers and pulled down some of the posters